So this is our presentation team today. And what we are doing is we are sharing a donut that's good for California, and we are inviting everyone here on this call to partner with us. This process over this past year of creating a California donut snapshot has been entirely a partnership every step of the way. The data, the reviewing, and the dissemination. And so we're going to continue with that partnering for this time together. And we do have some questions for us to consider as we go through just a light introduction to California Donut Economics Coalition. The snapshot is we would really love to invite you all to consider these questions. One, what stands out to you? What feels irrelevant and alive, particularly in terms of your work? What is it about the California donut that aligns with the work that you're doing or work that you are involved with or that you know about, that you're excited about? How does this research inform your work? How does this research support you and inform the work you do? And what programs or plans would help California get within the donut? And then finally, would you be willing to be a part of a roundtable that's related to each of the donut sections? So we'll be sharing those questions again at the end, but just want to drop them in for us all to consider, to think about. We really want to start with gratitude, starting from gratitude for the lands of California, the more than human world, the natural beings that really support us and that we feel in relation with. We also want to really uplift and appreciate the indigenous peoples of the past, present, and future, stewards of this land. We also want to appreciate the donut economics community. So Kate Rayworth, who wrote Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, as well as the entire DEAL community. So we really feel like we are part of a larger community, including all of you as partners today. So just a little note of coming from gratitude today. Who are we? So who is the California Donut Economics Coalition? So we are a worker self-directed nonprofit. And that means that we're trying to bring in the donut economics principles and practices into how we operate. So if you know of a worker cooperative, it is similar to a worker cooperative, but for a nonprofit. And what we're working towards is creating a California where people and planet thrive together. And we have a 4-pronged strategy. So creating a new economic narrative for California, one that is based on a holistic sense of well-being for people and the planet. We collaborate with existing change makers like yourselves. We spark donut initiatives and policies that are often local or bioregional, so different scales. And then we share a donut snapshot of California. And that is really a part of what we're really focused on right now in our work. Just to remind us, in case you're not as familiar with the donut or would appreciate a reminder, here is the donut here in this space right here. The donut is coming from Kate Rayworth and the donut economics community, and it's a measurement tool. So it's really a measurement tool that helps us guide our economies towards ecologically safe and socially just economies. And so it's a new goal of the economy, and then it's a measurement tool. As Dr. Haven Toe says, we are attentive to what we measure. We are attentive to what we measure. So it gives us a measurement tool of that which is really important to us. And it has a few components. One is the social foundation, and that's this inner part, the donut hole, so to speak, which are the areas to measure human well-being from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we're going to hear today about how California is doing in each of these areas and how much shortfall there is. Then on the outer ring of the donut, they have the ecological ceiling. So these are the planetary boundaries. These are the tipping points for our ecological systems. And so these are ways that our planet, our ecology can sustain change and even impact. But if they go behind certain tipping points, it really impacts our planet, our ecosystems negatively. So we're also going to hear about how California is doing in terms of these ecological boundaries, and we're going to learn where we are in overshoot. So now I'm going to hand over to Julian to share a little bit more. Julian, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Della, for the introduction and the grounding, and thank you all for joining. So this is an image you've probably seen before. This is the global GDP over the last 100 years, and it paints a pretty rosy picture of the global economy humming along. But probably, as many of you in the room know, that this isn't really the whole picture. And I just want to acknowledge that critiques of GDP as an instrument for measuring the economy are definitely not new. There was a well-known speech from 1968 where Bobby Kennedy famously says that GDP measures everything except that which is worthwhile. And if you haven't seen that speech, it's a worthwhile to check it out. And yet, almost 60 years later, GDP remains the dominant economic indicator. In addition to things maybe like inflation and deficit, the GDP is the thing that really is what most people think of when they think about the economy. And what's interesting about donut economics is it tries to add a kind of a more multidimensional take to what we think about as the economy. And so you can go to the next slide. So this is a different picture of the economy, you could say, and in many ways. So this is essentially putting numbers to what the graphic that Della showed previously. On the left, you have the picture of the global economy. And so this is the latest data that we have in terms of the performance of the the world in terms of these social and ecological indicators. And then on the right, you have the US donut. And so what you see is a world deeply out of balance. Globally, billions of people don't have access to basic needs, and human activity is causing widespread ecological breakdown. So we've transgressed 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries that Della was mentioning earlier, and we continue to move deeper into ecological precarity. In the United States, you can see we are well beyond our fair share in terms of resource use and carbon pollution and things like this. And this analysis is from 2022. And essentially, it looks in this graphic that the United States is performing pretty well in terms of social indicators. But it's important to note that this study was a global comparison. So it's showing that we have shortfall in income equality here, which is the only indicator that looks like we're not performing well on. But this is actually not quite the full picture because this is it's a relative study. So for instance, the income threshold in this study for poverty is $5.50 per day, which is obviously far below a living wage in the United States. So you'll see in California, the social data in terms of our performance is far worse because we're using indicators and thresholds that better reflect the basic living standards in the United States. And yeah, so it's just wanted to kind of sit with this a little bit, the fact that, the United States is the richest country in the world with the highest GDP, and then California is the richest state in the US. And despite that massive amount of economic growth and productive capacity, we are still falling short on meeting the basic needs of millions of people, and we're obviously way outside of our planetary boundaries. And so that's why we're trying to get folks to think about these other dimensions in terms of our economy. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so we really want to acknowledge that we are not alone in this work. In many ways, we're actually late adopters. So there are people adopting this snapshot or this donut economics framework all over the world. And you can see this map here. All those dots are various entities that have engaged with the donut in different ways. And then here I'm highlighting a few studies. So Amsterdam was one of the first cities that adopted the donut, and it's like formally part of their city planning and policy process. and they've done a deep dive in terms of their analysis in terms of how they perform on these social and ecological indicators. Melbourne just came out with this beautiful, interactive website that shows their donut. And then finally wanted to call out the Scottish donut because California is more similar to the size of a country. And so I wanted to show that it's happened at that scale of an economy as well. You can go to the next slide. And yeah, this is just essentially reiterating what I was just saying. There's groups all over the world doing it. And you can click one more time, Della, and you'll see, so that's California Donut Economics. So we're part of this global community of researchers and policymakers and practitioners that are thinking about these ideas around the world. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, now as we kind of move towards the California donut, and we're about to get into to hear more about the actual data and the findings, we just wanted to ground in our goals for creating this California donut. So our goals were kind of threefold. First was simply measure California's current ecological overshoot and social shortfall. Pretty simple. The second was to reframe economic performance to align with social and ecological goals. And I think it's important here, by reframe, really, we're this study that we conducted, it was essentially taking existing data, and in many cases, existing, initiatives that are ongoing in the state of California, and really trying to uplift them. So we're really just building and trying to strengthen the ongoing work that's happening in California. And I'm going to talk about in a bit a lot of the partners that we relied on to build this data, but just to show that this information is not new, but this is a new way of framing it to really try to get more attention to it. And the third goal is to inspire wider adoption of this framework within local governments, educational institutions, and community organizations. And then these are our key audiences here, thinking about state level policy making, city sustainability officers and policymakers adopting this framework, and then local organizations and nonprofits using it as they can, and then also really thinking about educators, I think, high school all the way through the graduate level, using this specific California information and also this broader economic framework that is donut economics. There's a ton of potential because it's this very engaging tool. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. So quickly, this is a little bit about our process. So in spring earlier this year, so spring 2024, we started a really robust research process, and essentially looked at a bunch of different indicators across all of the different social and ecological categories, and then went through a long data validation process. And many of you all are those data validators, so really none of this work would have been possible without your collaboration. So thank you all for being here again. And then we went back into a drafting stage where we're trying to think about making sense of all these different indicators and narrowing the indicators. And then we moved into a design phase where we started thinking about, okay, how do we communicate this effectively? And I'll flag here. So today, actually, and now it's going to be live on our website soon, and I think folks could actually put a link in the chat now. But so today we published our snapshot, so that should be live. And then in the fall of 2025, we'll publish a more detailed report, which will essentially go into more detail of each social and ecological category, and also have some more additional context and policy related kind of history as well. So that's a little bit of our process, and you can go to the next slide. And yeah, I was just referring to this, but again, just really kind of calling out gratitude for all the different organizations that have helped us pull this together. And as I was saying, we're building off this amazing sort of foundation of research that's already taking place in California, and many of these organizations are doing really important work to get us back into the donut, even though that's not the language that's being used. So people, there's amazing work all around the state already ongoing. And here are just a few of the partners that we worked with in this process. And we're always looking for more partners, both on the research and the policy side of things. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, now I'm going to hand it over to Alights to dive into the findings from the California donut.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks everyone for being here. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Della. So the donut provides an overview of California's social and ecological performance, and we really hope that this snapshot can serve as a compass to help orient us towards meeting the needs of all people within the limits of the planet. And here you can see a little bit overview of our findings, and we're falling short on 100% of the social indicators we measured and overshooting on 89% of the ecological indicators, with the average social shortfall being 34% and the average ecological overshoot at 283%. In the next few slides, we'll dig deeper into what this visualization represents. And now I want to talk a little bit about how we collected these indicators and also assessed shortfall and overshoot. You can go ahead to the next slide. So Julian talked a little bit about our process. Really began with this review of previous donut reports, combining existing social and ecological indicators for the state of California. And we considered over 200 indicators and selected around 100 as potential fits for the 20 or so categories that are generally included in donut assessments. And Julian talked a little bit as well about how we collaborated with experts from the Donut Economics Action Lab, with regional experts, with local academic, governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, and community groups to help us narrow down and improve the list. And in the end, we have the Social Foundation made up of 24 indicators divided between 12 categories, while the ecological ceiling consists of 18 indicators divided into 9 categories. And many of these indicators appear in other donut reports or in other assessments, but others are specific to the California context. And around 50% are documented by government agencies, 30% by NGOs, and 20% by academic reports or peer-reviewed articles. And with that, let's dig a little bit into the data. We can go ahead and go to the next slide and also click twice to reveal the final social and ecological indicators in spreadsheet form rather than in the beautiful graphic form. Some people like to see it as a table, or to see the way it can look as a table. And here we can see how each indicator has both a current estimate, a desirable target, and these two are then combined to assess the level of overshoot. And many of you maybe already know, outside of the donut framework, it's quite common to have data points that are not linked to a desirable target. And that can make it really difficult, our job at the research end, to assess overshoot and shortfall. And we tried to use aspirational targets that align with science, and also what we hear from groups who are working on these issues in California. And I think it's been mentioned already, but we do consider this a living document and hope to include updates based on feedback in the future. And this goes for both the targets and the indicators themselves. And you could make the argument that some of our targets are too aspirational, maybe almost impossible to achieve, especially on the social side, where we generally aim for 100% or 0%. And we don't really see that as a weakness. Rather, it fits with this idea of the donut as a compass. While a compass points north, the reason we have a compass is not to take us to some place called north, but rather to orient us in the right direction. And we'll talk a little more how this manifests itself later in the presentation. And for now, we can go ahead to the next slide. Here we zoom in on the ecological ceiling, back to the graphic form, and we see a few words which describe each indicator to go along with the general level of overshoot. And we can see here, for example, that the category climate change is made up of 2 indicators, greenhouse gas emissions and renewable electricity. These are abbreviations, and the full indicators, they appeared in the table you saw a moment ago, and they'll also appear in the donut unrolled visualizations, which we will explore shortly. During this research, I found there was really a lack of information related to consumption-based environmental indicators for states like California. We've talked about how it's a large, wealthy state with many decisions made at the state level, so this seems like quite a gap in the literature and necessary to inform policy. Producing new indicators is beyond the scope of this report, which really seeks to compile existing information, existing indicators, but this is something we would like to explore more in the future, along with a time series. So providing, rather than just one point in time estimate, rather seeing how this picture has changed over time. With that, we can go ahead to the next slide. And we can click twice to reveal the local aspirations and planetary boundaries. Some of you may be familiar with this 4-lens approach, which considers 2 sides of the ecological coin. So basically, how is our society matching nature's generosity? This is sometimes called our local aspirations. And then how is society impacting nature globally through our consumption patterns? This is referred to usually as the planetary boundaries. And we considered having two donuts, one with global indicators and one with local indicators. And in the end, we decided to combine both into one donut, which has, of course, strengths and weaknesses. Often the easier something is to understand at first glance, the more of the intricacies are lost. But we tried to find a balance here of being easy to understand while also presenting enough information to make it meaningful. Here you can also see the year the indicator was assessed. We tried to use the most recent indicators available, but in some cases we thought it's important to include an indicator even if it's not measured in the most recent calendar year, or if it's not being measured on a yearly basis, particularly on the ecological side. And we hope that the report can encourage governments or other organizations to consider tracking these indicators that we see as vital to our future. And given the state of the information, there's often this trade-off between having the best indicator to capture a topic and then having an indicator that is being assessed yearly. So we tried to again, strike the balance there. We can go ahead to the next slide. And now we see the donut unrolled, the next layer of complexity in graphic form. So now we see the percent overshoot expressed numerically, the full name of the indicator. I would say this is probably the best place to look for hotspots or discern patterns or maybe spot discrepancies between two indicators in one category. And we can see now that greenhouse gas emissions, for example, is measured per capita. It's consumption-based perspective, and we're over 1,000% over the safe limit. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You can also see that renewable electricity is measuring the percent of electricity from non-renewable sources. And we're really using this gold standard of solar, wind, and geothermal as renewable sources. And as with all the indicators, this is a compromise. We could have included hydropower, biomass, and nuclear as renewables, as the state of California generally does, and the overshoot would then be lower. But what if we had considered all energy from renewables rather than just electricity? Electricity is this small portion of total energy use, then the overshoot would have been far higher. I think this point highlights that there's a lot behind these numbers, and we try to get into that a little more in these section reports. And we're planning to have one section report for each category to dive deeper into the nuances that are not captured in these numbers. That's forthcoming, so you can look for that in the next couple months. It's not in part of this current report, but we do have a preview here. If you go to the next slide to show you what one of those section reports might look like. Diving into climate change, you could imagine this as the next layer of complexity. So you see the actual data point for California along with the unit of measurement, 12.1 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per capita per year, per person per year, excuse me. And you also see the desirable target, which is used to calculate the level of overshoot, in this case, 1 ton per person per year. And the target here is based on downscaling the planetary boundaries framework to a per capita level that's in line with the 1.5 to 2 degree limit codified in the Paris climate agreements. In these reports, we include some information related to each category, or rather, we include some indicators for each category that didn't make the final cut. We have these 2 representative indicators, but I mentioned we considered quite a few more indicators, so we mentioned some of those here, and we also try to provide some context and background and mention some of the most important policies related to this issue, and also note how things are changing over time. Even though we could provide a full time series for all the indicators, we try to capture that here to some extent. And finally, we highlight inequalities, both within the state and between countries, to understand how power and justice impact these challenges. Here's an example of that. You can see the map on the bottom left, where it's showing how carbon footprint changes depending on what neighborhood you're in San Francisco, predictably wealthier neighborhoods being responsible for most emissions. Meanwhile, countries and locations with the least emissions will be hardest hit by climate change. And thanks to our partners over at the Cool Climate Lab for both producing this map and also reviewing this section for us. Now on to the social foundations. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Julian mentioned how this is where we can see the biggest discrepancy between the national donuts that appear on the Good Life for All website. And he mentioned how their research is compiling data from most nations for a range of social and ecological indicators. And because of that, they use thresholds that are applicable to most nations. And it's hard for them to accurately capture this local context, as Julian exemplified with poverty line. Here we use a poverty line that's more in line with the context of California, and predictably that leads to more shortfall. And I think Julian mentioned that shouldn't be taken to mean California is performing below the US average. Rather, we used more aspirational targets applicable to the local context. Go ahead to the next slide. The donut lenses approach can also be applied to the social foundation. So on one hand, we can think about how is our society meeting the needs of people within California, the social thresholds. And then on the other hand, how is our society impacting people around the world through our consumption patterns? This is sometimes referred to as our global responsibilities. I found that the global social indicators were probably the most difficult to measure, at least quantitatively, compared to any other category. Least researched in the donut framework and also beyond the donut framework in the academic literature. And there are some interesting studies looking at measures of appropriated wealth, labor, land, energy, and materials between nations, but none of that has been extended to the state level. Some other donut reports have taken a more qualitative approach, looking at stories. And you can imagine, for example, how companies, practices, California companies like Apple, if you click, you can reveal Apple, and click one more time to reveal Tesla. You can think about how these companies treat workers in their factories and along their supply chains around the world. Or you can think about bank investments, California banks, and how their practices might impact climate change and local communities in the US and also abroad. If you click one more time, you could also think about how US military interventions are impacting people in other countries. A lot of the bombs from there are being made in California, and how that's impacting our global responsibilities and people's lives in other countries. So we didn't include any global social indicators in this report, but I think it's a priority for future reports to try to capture these global responsibilities in addition to the time series assessment that I mentioned. And I'll finish off by talking a little bit about the Social Foundation Unrolled. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Now we can see the percent shortfall and the full indicator names. And before I pass it over to Stephanie to zoom in on each one of these categories, I wanted to mention one more time about our choice to use aspirational targets of 100%. In the global national donuts that we keep mentioning, they use the social target of 95% often. And in that case, you can see the 2% over here on the far right. That's 2% of people who receive their water from systems that do not meet water quality standards. If we use the 95% rather than the 100%, they would not be considered in shortfall. There would not be considered to be a shortfall there, but there's more than 1 million Californians who are represented by that 2% and who are receiving their water from these faulty systems. So again, a sort of compromise, but hopefully this makes it clear why we chose to use the aspirational targets, even if it's almost practically impossible to achieve that 100% are reaching this goal. And with that, I'll pass it over to Stephanie, who will now take some time to walk us through how California is performing in each category and for each indicator. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Elythe. As he mentioned, I'll now will provide a high-level overview for each category and some additional context in many of them so you can get a general sense of how California is performing. As I mentioned, our donut development team, myself, Julian, and Elythe, worked for almost a year to develop the snapshot, and that included Brian Dowling facilitating all of the discussions, and then Jamie Chesbro and John Leiden, want to shout out them as well, who are contributed to the indicator research, who are on this call. The report, it will be available today for download, so we'll share the link at the end of the presentation. I've already seen some folks share questions in the chat, and I just want to encourage folks, as more questions come up and we get into the detailed findings, that you keep asking those questions and that our team will do our best to respond to them. Next slide. So starting with the Social Foundation, let's take a closer look to how California is performing amongst the 12 categories that we have identified. Next slide. So to represent food, we've chosen food insecurity and vegetables per day. In the United States, food insecurity is the condition in which individuals or households lack reliable access to sufficient quantity of affordable and nutritious food. It can manifest in various ways, including worry about running out of food, reducing meal sizes, or skipping meals altogether. And then we have vegetables per day. This indicator measures dietary habits and access to nutritious food, highlighting food insecurity in a community as well. And so regular vegetable consumption relies on the availability and affordability of fresh produce. And in food deserts, where access to grocery stores is limited, obtaining a variety of vegetables can be difficult. So thus, tracking vegetable intake provides insights into healthy food accessibility and food insecurity levels within a population. Next slide. Health was perhaps one of the most challenging categories to really find two representative indicators, since there's so many factors that influence health and it can be defined in so many ways. Life expectancy is a very popular indicator around the globe, so we found it important to include it to be able to compare with other donuts. And then given the US healthcare system and its costs, affordability is our other indicator here. We considered indicators such as percent of people without medical insurance, percent of adults diagnosed with high blood pressure, primary care physician to patient ratio. And we also considered including a representative mental health indicator, such as percent of adults reporting symptoms of anxiety or depression, and a few others. And so, as Alights alluded to, we'll have a more comprehensive report in the spring that will go into at least some of the other context factors around health across California. Next slide. For education, here we have literacy rate, and then we've also included student loan debt as an indicator to get a sense of the financial challenges in accessing higher education and achieving economic stability after graduation. It highlights educational affordability, adequacy of financial aid, and potential barriers to long-term success. Next slide. For income and work, we've thought about this and really thinking through that in the richest state in the US, 1 in every 5 residents is in poverty. We have the supplemental poverty rate here, which provides a more accurate measure of poverty by including government assistance programs like food stamps and tax credits, while accounting for necessary expenses such as medical costs and regional living expenses. This measure offers a broader understanding of economic hardship than the traditional poverty rate. The other indicator we have here is the U6 unemployment rate, which is a measure of people struggling in the job market. It includes those who are unemployed, those who have stopped looking for work because they feel there are no jobs, and people stuck in part-time jobs when they want full-time work. It's a broader view of unemployment compared to the standard rate. Next slide. For peace and justice, we have violent crime and the police scorecard. Violent crime is a pretty significant issue across California, as you can see, including an indicator related to policing practices within peace and justice is about assessing whether all communities are treated fairly and equally, particularly marginalized groups. The police scorecard is a platform that rates police departments based on factors such as use of force, racial disparities, and transparency. And the score, we're using the average score in the 4 specific areas that they measure. Next slide. Political voice is pretty straightforward here with indicators related to voter turnout and percent of eligible voters who are not eligible to vote. Next slide. For social cohesion, we have income inequality and happiness as indicators. For income inequality, we're using the Gini index, which measures income inequality, higher values showing more inequality and lower values showing more equality. High inequality can harm social cohesion by creating divisions and reducing trust in society. When incomes are more equal, people tend to feel more connected and unified, making society more stable and cooperative. All Californians live in a county that has significantly unequal wealth distribution. Happiness is an area also linked to social cohesion. When people feel happy, they're more likely to engage with their communities, trust others, and build positive relationships, all of which strengthen social bonds. High levels of happiness often correlate with feelings of safety, support, and belonging, and creating a sense of shared purpose that brings people together. In contrast, areas with low happiness levels may experience lower trust and engagement, leading to weaker social connections. Next slide. Equality is based on the Sustainable Development Goal number 10. There's a 12, and for our category, we've included equality measure related to gender and an equity measure relating to race. There's a 12% shortfall for gender pay gap. The Racial Equity Index inclusion score comes from the National Equity Atlas. The inclusion score measures how a given geography is doing compared with its peers in terms of racial gaps across 9 indicators included in the Racial Equity Index, considering 6 racial ethnic groups there. And the economic vitality includes measuring racial gaps in median wage, unemployment and poverty. Readiness includes educational attainment, disconnected youth and school poverty, and connectedness includes air pollution, commute time, and rent burden. Next slide. For housing, we've included here the point in time count of unhoused people and then a percent of renters with housing costs that exceed 30% of household income. To secure federal funding for homelessness programs, California conducts a point in time count at least every other year on a designated night in January. This count aims to estimate the number of people experiencing homelessness, both sheltered and unsheltered. And this shortfall was determined by comparing how California performs compared to other OECD countries. And then staying below 30% for housing costs promotes financial security and offers a standardized measure of affordability with some flexibility for local variations. It's a guideline and not a strict rule, but a valuable tool for understanding housing costs. Exceeding this threshold limits discretionary income for essential savings, hindering financial security and investment potential. Next slide. For connectivity and transportation, we have internet access and the transit report card. In terms of internet access, 15.5% of households are without an internet subscription. Rural areas in particular face significant challenges. And additionally, low-income households are disproportionately affected, with affordability being a primary barrier. For transportation, we're utilizing the transit report card developed by Transportation of America, a program of Smart Growth America. We're using the overall score, which encompasses California's current spending levels on public transit, restrictions on transit funding, total miles driven by all vehicles in a given year, and transit access, which looks at number of jobs you can reach within a 45-minute drive. Next slide. The energy category specifically relates to Sustainable Development Goal number 7, that everyone should have the right to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. There's disparities related to race and other marginalized communities, particularly Black, Latinx, and Native American households, as well as families residing in low-income multifamily housing experience disproportionately high energy burdens. Low-income households in California are also more likely to have their power shut up after a heat wave due to inability to pay. And vulnerable and historically marginalized communities are also disproportionately impacted by power outages. Next slide. In California, several areas are in the San Joaquin Valley face significant water contamination issues, including pesticides and arsenic. These communities, often rural and predominantly Latino or Latinx or farm worker populations, struggle with access to safe drinking water, highlighting the disproportionate impact of environmental pollution on marginalized groups. Limited resources and delayed infrastructure improvements contribute to the ongoing water crisis in these regions. For sanitation access, some studies report exact numbers and some say greater than 200,000. So we have just calculated the percent overshoot using 200,000. Next slide. So now let's take a closer look into how California is performing in the 9 ecological ceiling categories we've identified. The first, next slide, is climate change. Wanted to note here that as we're going through for these ecological indicators, some of them are highlighted in blue to indicate which of them have a global impact outside of California. You'll also notice that we've shortened the sources in this section because many indicators have multiple sources to identify California's status as well as the desirable amount. Greenhouse gas emissions represent the greatest overshoot across all indicators here. And for renewable electricity, the ideal would be 100% of electricity from renewable sources. So we've calculated 62% as an overshoot, showing that 62% of California's electricity is from non-renewable sources. And as a note, according to the California Air Quality Resources Board, the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in California are transportation, industry, electricity generation, residential commercial buildings, and agriculture. And while some Californians have carbon footprints below the average, wealthy individuals emit 50 plus tons per year. Next slide. Ocean acidification occurs when increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are absorbed by the ocean, leading to a decrease in the pH of seawater. This process harms marine life, particularly organisms that rely on calcium to build shells and skeletons, such as corals and shellfish. Along with rising temperatures, acidification will likely kill most existing reefs in the next decades. 25% of ocean lives ocean life lives around these coral reefs. Here we have the change in pH compared to pre-industrial levels, as well as the consumption-based indicator sulfur dioxide. The emissions per capita is one way to measure global impacts of consumption activities in regards to ocean acidification. Next slide. Chemical pollution also has significant overshoots. There's a lot more context that could be shared about chemical pollution, but other indicators we considered were pounds of waste generated per capita, statewide recycling rate, percent of active public water systems found contaminated with PFAS. But here we've landed on landfill percent of waste sent to landfill or overseas, and then toxic exports, percent of toxic chemicals released per year. Next slide. Particulate matter indicator is measuring percentage of airs where air quality exceeds a yearly average of 12 micrograms of fine particulate matter per cubic meter. And then high levels of this can be harmful to health. And then we also have the O3 pollution, which is a percentage of air basins where ozone levels exceed 0.07 parts per million for more than 10 days a year, based on an 8-hour average, indicating poor air quality that can pose health risks. Next slide. For freshwater use, we're looking at groundwater and water footprint. Groundwater makes up 40 to 60% of California's water supply, depending on economic and environmental conditions. Groundwater storage is declining in many parts of the state, especially in the Central Valley. Water footprint is a consumption-based measure that includes total in-state water use minus water embedded in exported products, plus water embedded in imported products. The per capita water footprint then represents the average water use for a Californian, which can be compared with global fair share and sustainability thresholds. And in terms of, we didn't include surface water here because they're very difficult to calculate, but flow in California's two major watersheds, the Bay Delta and Colorado Basin, are both highly impaired and likely below levels to maintain ecosystem integrity. Next slide. For land use, we have forest cover and ecological footprint. Forest cover is a vital planetary boundary because forests absorb carbon, regulate climate, support biodiversity, and maintain water cycles. The boundary is set at 50% to prevent ecological tipping points, ensuring that forests can continue to stabilize climate and biodiversity. California has experienced significant forest cover loss in recent decades, with nearly 7% of tree cover disappearing since 1985. The ecological footprint measures the amount of natural resources and ecosystem services consumed by an individual or population relative to the planet's ability to regenerate those resources. Ecological footprint accounts for human use of cropland, forests for timber, built-up land, grazing land, and fishing grounds on the consumption side, and land need to capture carbon dioxide on the waste absorption side. Next slide. For protected area, we've included both land and sea area. The desirable, again, is 50%, which is in line with the Nature Needs Half framework, based on research suggesting that protecting at least half of the planet's natural areas is crucial to preventing biodiversity loss, maintaining ecosystem health, and addressing climate change. At-risk species is the second highest overshoot across all ecological indicators. California actually has the highest concentration of species at risk across the United States. Changes in land use, invasive species, disease, climate change, and pollution are the main threats to biodiversity. Indigenous communities safeguard most of the world's remaining biodiversity, and meanwhile, they're squeezed into smaller and smaller tracts of land, forced out mainly by agriculture and resource extraction. Next slide. This is the only category where California is fully within the ecological limits here for ozone depletion. The first one, ozone depleting substances, is measured by whether or not we're compliant with the Montreal Protocol on the ozone depleting substances. So this is a yes or no. And then the ozone layer is specific to the global average thickness of the ozone layer. Next slide. For nitrogen and phosphorus, we talk about these because they're essential for life and can cause serious environmental problems when disruptive. Human activities like farming and burning fossil fuels have greatly increased the amounts of these nutrients in nature. This excess can lead to eutrophication, where too many nutrients cause harmful algae blooms that deplete oxygen and water, harming fish and other aquatic life. During these nutrient cycles, Disrupting these nutrient cycles threatens ecosystems and biodiversity, which are vital for a healthy planet. Here we have one indicator representing nitrogen, and then eutrophication, which is the process by which water bodies like lakes, rivers, and coastal areas become overly enriched with nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. And then next slide. So the next slide. Oh, it got skipped. It was supposed to be refreshed. Go, it's okay. I think it wasn't refreshed before you
It's
pressed.
okay. I think, I think we moved.
I just want to make a note. We
Yeah,
can
yeah,
go
go ahead.
back here of the equity considerations. There was another slide that you could read a little bit better, so apologies that this is smaller, but we've touched on some of this with a handful of categories today, but these indicators do not give the full story, and we just wanted to really emphasize that as we examine the social, ecological, and economic challenges facing California, it's really important to recognize that these issues do not impact all communities equally. And here are some marginalized communities across California that have experienced intensified challenges and disproportionate burden related to these issues. And then I'll pass it back to Julian.
I think we're gonna I'll pass it over to you, Della. I think for time, we're just going to split into the breakout rooms so that folks can discuss more.
Yes, thank you all for listening, and thank you all for hearing all these elements. And again, reminding us of our questions. What stood out to you as you were listening? What donut-aligned projects and endeavors are you involved with and excited about? How does this research inform your work? What programs or plans would help California get into the donut? And would you be interested in participating in a roundtable on your topic area? So these are just some questions to get us starting to think and discuss together. We now have some breakout rooms. We'll have 4 breakout rooms, and we'll let you decide which one you want to join. Breakout room number 1 is policy. So if you want to share about policy or discuss policy, or you are related to policy, please go to that room. Room number 2 is data and research. So if you want to join that room, you can join that room, room number 2. Room number 3 is education, and room number 4 are folks involved with organizations or other. And so we're going to let you choose which room and decide. And if you're unable or unwilling to participate in a breakout room, that's fine. You can hang out in our waiting room, and it'll be about 10 minutes before we rejoin the whole group for group discussion and conversations. Yeah, welcome all back from our breakout rooms. I know there were varying sizes, so I know that some of the groups you didn't get to share very much, but hopefully at least you got started. And we do have the rest of our time here for group conversation and questions. So feel free to raise your hand. That's the most helpful way that I can call on folks. The raise hand function is at the bottom of your screen. There's a hand, and then it says raise hand. That's the best way. And then I can call on folks. You can unmute and share what it is that you came to in your group discussion, or maybe a question that came as you were sharing with one another. So who would like to share? What stood out to you? What's feeling relevant by way of partnering? What is the work you're doing that could help us get within the donut? What's next? All right, Dave, over to you.
I just mentioned in our breakout room about our pilot program and the fact so this is we're presenting the donut to partners. So that's the data heavy part of it. We also have programs where we're reaching out to local communities, and we have local groups in San Diego and San Jose. People reached out to us, and then we've been meeting with them, providing support of various kinds, including fundraising and presentation. So I just want to throw that out there because we are doing that work also, and we didn't get to mention it very much today. And I know there might be people who are really interested in that. So I'll put my email in the chat. And if you're interested in that sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of activism and getting on the street, we're also doing that work. So I just want to mention that. Thanks, Stella.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks for putting your info in the chat. Beautiful. Anyone else? Any questions or comments? Anything that you came to in your group, or any questions that you had as you were listening, or anything related to the questions that we offered?
Also, because Dave said that, I am actually on my way to San Diego, and we're going to be hosting. It's going to be a very dynamic experience of donut economics, where we're going to actually have people from the government, from the nonprofit industry, from academia, as well as from the military down in San Diego joining this donut conversation. And we're going to come up, do some workshopping and some working circles, and actually create some call to actions at this event in San Diego for San Diego County. So this is already happening in actuality. So if you all want to do that county and have something where we bring in the different stakeholders and we educate, but we also have some call to actions as well, that would be awesome.
Thank you, Indy. Seth in San Francisco, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Seth Fury. I used to work for Joint Venture Silicon Valley Network. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but Joint Venture publishes an annual index of Silicon Valley and has been doing this since about 1995, maybe a little bit earlier. So Joint Venture has a lot of experience with pulling this kind of data for a specific geography together. A lot of it is social indicators. So in our discussion about research, I was very concerned about sustainability of this program. And we heard that there was a $100,000 grant made from Cisco, which is terrific. But what's the future? So these kinds of programs need to be institutionalized and they need funding. And I'm wondering, where we're going with this initiative in terms of making it sustainable, financially sustainable, of course.
Yeah, Seth, great question, and thank you. And yeah, we were grateful to receive funding for our first year, and then that ends in February of next year, and so we don't have any funding after that. We did start as volunteers, and we do hope to continue in whatever way that we can. We do have ways that we're looking for grants and donations and things like that, as well as ways that we can sustain ourselves through like a cohort and other consulting opportunities. And Kali is our abundance lead, can put their information in the chat. But excellent question, and one that a lot of organizations of similar style are also grappling with. Francisca, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to say the ideal is to have something like a donut metric included at the California state level, the same that they are measuring other economic metrics. Some other states have begun initiatives like that. For example, I know that Vermont has a partnership between a nonprofit and the University of Vermont, and every 2 years they update this indicator. It's like a state happiness indicator of well-being. And so right now, a part of our policy efforts are geared towards having those connections into Sacramento and becoming established as people who help shape such a future indicator. So that would be the continuation of that. And as we're working on funding, I think this is one of our main ideas going forward, to have policy include that, so that then we can be assured that the prioritization of whatever measures California takes are working towards more well-being.
Thank you. Bill, I see your hand. Over to you.
Yeah, so in our group, there was mention of sort of the sourcing of the data, and that this was, really largely sourced from other places, and that the numerator data, the sort of the impact data, was from one place usually, and the threshold data was from elsewhere. So I guess my question is, did any of that threshold data already do the marrying of the impact and then assessing whether it was, over threshold or under threshold, or is that something that really added to the mix? And I guess this sort of follow on to that is, did you find in your sort of sourcing of this data that people kind of realize the need to have that marriage in order to have the information really be contextually relevant, or was this kind of a new perspective for folks?
Lights, Julian or Stephanie,
Sure.
do you want to respond?
I can start.
Great.
That's a great question. I found it was a really new perspective for most people. It was really difficult. I was like wringing scientists' neck sometimes to try to get them to give me a number or to point me to a study. But yeah, in terms of one indicator being from one place, or the indicator being from one place and the threshold from the other, I think there is a group of scientists, these people who are concerned with the planetary boundaries, the ecological economics in particular, industrial ecology, who are thinking about, they call it absolute sustainability assessment. Maybe you've heard this term, but thinking about, taking these planetary boundaries and then downscaling it to the per capita level. So a lot of the work has been done in terms of downscaling it to the per capita level. So for those national donuts, for example, they've looked at a lot of different indicators, ecological and social, and they have targets there. So then it was combining that work that's been done in life cycle assessment and environmentally extended input-output assessment on the national level, on the per capita level, and then taking the target, or rather the number, that exists for California, and combining it with those thresholds that exist more on the global level. So in the ecological side, it was mostly that. On the social side, it was generally more of these aspirational targets. Like we said, we wanted 0% of people to be in poverty or something like that. So we could look at a lot of literature to justify that. The needs-based approach, or needs-based research, I think, has done quite a bit of quantifying what people need for a good life and these types of work. So we could draw on there as well. But I don't know if Julian, you want to jump in and give some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe just point out one more thing about the variation between indicators. So not like there's some indicator thresholds, like for instance, we had like the household, or housing burden. So renting burden is like 30%. So in the literature, if you're spending over the 30% of your income on housing, then that's categorized as like severe high housing burden, for instance. So that's a pretty clear threshold. That's like debatable, but that's in the literature. Whereas something like, water, and I know there's some folks on the call that are water experts in California that talk to you about water thresholds. And obviously water is a really contentious issue, but thinking about like, what is the threshold for sustainable yield for water in California, that's a very tricky conversation. And there's political boundaries, there's ecological boundaries, there's different ways you could slice it. And so we did our best to kind of navigate all those different dimensions. So in some cases it's more clear, in other cases it's more contentious. And I think like we try to lay out what we did, and obviously we want this to be kind of a document that again points us in the right direction. I think a lot of these boundaries are, like the specific boundary is less important. Acknowledging that we need to be moving in this direction and focusing on these things is the most important, I think, element we're trying to get at.
And I think just to follow up on that, I think the water category provides a good way to look at two different ways of calculating the boundaries. So for one of them, we had this report that said 63% of the water in California is being pulled from critically overdrafted basins. So there we have built into the report this target, as Julian was saying, similar to in the housing literature. But then for our other water target is the consumption-based water footprint. So we have accounting for trade, how much water people in California are using. And then for this, we had the number coming from one place, and then the target coming from these sort of national or global estimates of per capita planetary boundaries for water use. So exemplifying two different ways we did that there in the water category.
So you did allow for tapping into groundwater as compared to just setting the threshold based on renewable, in other words, precipitation?
Our threshold is, for the local threshold, is based on the percent of water coming from these critically overdrafted basins. And there's a whole bunch, there's a 100-page report where they get more into what does that really mean, critically overdrafted basins. And
okay.
Yeah, maybe Julian could talk a little bit about that, or we can, maybe take it offline.
Yeah, the department,
they're not as interested.
Yeah, I think we could nerd out a bunch about it, and there's maybe others on the call that could chime in as well. But it's the data we're using on the critically overdrafted basins from groundwater is from the Department of Water Resources. And there's differences of opinion about that data, but we did our best to kind of use it and think about a threshold for it. So
thanks, everyone.
All right. Any other questions? Oh, Lorenzo, over to you.
Hi, thank you. I couldn't find the raise hand button on my video here, so I raised my hand. Something that I brought up, I was in the education breakout group, and something that I encounter in daily life is collective denial. I think, and I saw some notes in the chat, people saying how overwhelming is all of these measures and how far away we are from the desirable. And yes, it's overwhelming. And at the same time, we need to see reality as it really is in order to be able to engage with things in a realistic manner. I'm a professional in energy policy, and I talk to hundreds of people who are professionals in that industry, and the collective denial is so strong. There's faith that technology will save us, or that more economic growth is going to save us and lift all boats. And as trite as those things sound, it's almost impossible to break through the belief, those religious types of belief. So I want to just emphasize the importance of education that gets into the psychology of people's denials and starting to understand, the extent to which we're programmed and conditioned by official narratives that tell us everything's okay, and we just need to continue doing more of the same, and it will all work out. So anyway, I wanted to bring that to folks' attention because to me, that's a huge challenge.
Thank you so much. Excellent point. Dej, over to you. Welcome.
Hi. Just to kind of follow on to that, one of the things I was playing around with, I multitask during any Zoom meeting, is someone mentioned the Melbourne interactive site. So I went over and was playing on it. And what's really interesting is the way it pulls in stories. So when you click on any one of the boundaries, it will then pull up a sidebar with the measurements, but then also with stories. And I think so many people assume that living within planetary boundaries means a lot of giving up a lot of what makes life comfortable. And what's nice about that is they're trying to put together kind of an inspiring narrative of what does food security look like if you have integrated food, integrated edible food within a neighborhood, or what does mobility look like if it's really integrated and accessible and green? Because I think the status quo does a great job of making it seem like they want you to have small windows and never have a hamburger again and so forth. And the focus of the conversation is what you can't do, rather than helping people see that, you go to Amsterdam and you see that it's actually a better, nicer lifestyle to be dependent on bicycles, not cars. So I think getting those stories out there to help visualize what the answer looks like is part of motivating and inspiring change.
Yeah, excellent points. Thank you so much for bringing that in. And I think someone's going to share the Melbourne donut in the chat so folks can look at that. Midi, welcome, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you so much for naming story, because I think that is the critical way for us to actually raise awareness and not paralyze at the same time. And in that regard, I just wanted to ask if you've got connections for, you're making wonderful offers for presentations, and are you well connected in with the climate reality chapters throughout California? Because these are people who are already in the climate story. They're already doing things on the ground. Like, for example, my local chapter, actually, I'm just on the edge of it, is the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and they're always looking for fresh presentations. This has been a wonderful one, and I thank you for all the work that you've done, and I hope it will proliferate.